In search of a simple piece of bread, a girl quietly enters the church. But upon hearing a millionaire confessing a secret to the priest, she realizes she has stumbled upon something much greater. The revelation connects her mother to the man, about to get married, shattering everything she believed. Desperate, she runs to tell her mother, but it's too late. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, tell us which city you're watching from, and let's continue. The scorching sun of New York punished the bustling streets, while urban chaos spread among honking horns and hurried footsteps. Inside St. Cecilia's Church, however, the contrast was absolute. The silence and welcoming coolness of the environment provided relief from the heat and external commotion. Edward Thompson, a renowned businessman about to marry the next day, walked near the altar, his face heavy with tension. Despite his impeccable suit and public image of success, an uncontrollable unease grew within him. His footsteps echoed softly down the central aisle of the church as his eyes traced the colorful stained glass windows, filtering the sunlight, creating ethereal patterns on the marble floor. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of old wood from the pews. Edward took a deep breath, summoning courage for what he was about to do. As he approached the confessional, Edward hesitated for a moment. His hands trembled slightly, and he felt a drop of sweat trickle down his forehead. With a deep sigh, he entered and sat down, closing the curtain behind him. On the other side of the screen, the silhouette of Father Michael materialized. "How can I help you, my son?" The priest's calm and comforting voice broke the silence. Edward closed his eyes, gathering courage. "Father, I need to confess something that has been tormenting me for years." "God is always ready to listen and forgive, my son. Speak without fear." With a trembling voice, Edward began to pour out the words he had kept buried in his heart for so long. 7 years ago, I committed an act of cowardice that changed the course of several lives. I abandoned Elizabeth, the woman I loved, when she told me she was pregnant. The priest remained silent, allowing Edward to continue his confession. "I had just graduated, starting my career. Fear and immaturity overwhelmed me. Instead of facing the situation, I simply disappeared. I cut off all contact with Elizabeth and never heard from her or the child again." Edward paused, swallowing hard. "Now, on the eve of my wedding to Marianne, this ghost from the past has come back to haunt me. I can't stop thinking about Elizabeth, about the child. How could I have been so selfish?" Father Michael reflected for a moment before responding. "My son, regret is the first step toward redemption, but it's not enough to feel remorse. You must take action to correct the mistakes of the past." "But how, Father? How can I fix something I destroyed so long ago?" "The path to making amends is not always easy, Edward, but it is necessary. You must seek out Elizabeth and the child. Take responsibility, even if it's late." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of his actions grow heavier. "And what about my marriage? Should I tell Marianne the truth?" "Honesty is essential in any relationship, my son. Marianne deserves to know the truth before she joins you before God." As the conversation continued, a small figure slipped into the church, seeking refuge from the relentless heat. Sophia, a 7-year-old girl in tattered clothes, entered quietly, her curious eyes scanning the majestic interior of the temple. Her light footsteps led her deeper into the church, where the sound of muffled voices caught her attention. Hiding behind one of the pews, Sophia heard a word that made her freeze. "Elizabeth." The girl's heart raced. Elizabeth was her mother's name. Though it was a common name, something about the way the man spoke piqued her curiosity. Sophia moved a little closer, trying to hear the conversation better. "Elizabeth never knew what happened to me after I ran away," Edward continued, his voice heavy with remorse. "I changed cities, switched numbers, blocked all contact. It was as if I had vanished from the face of the earth." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat. The man's words seemed to echo the story her mother sometimes mentioned in moments of sadness, the story of a man who had left before even knowing he would be a father. The girl stood there, motionless, absorbing every word of Edward's confession. Her young mind tried to process the possibility that this man, this well-dressed stranger in a luxurious church, could be the father she had never known. When Edward finally left the confessional, Sophia watched him intently. Her eyes caught every detail: the expensive suit, the shiny watch, the elegant demeanor. It was a world so far removed from hers, from the streets where she sold candy to help her sick mother. With her heart pounding, Sophia made a decision. She needed to tell her mother what she had discovered. Perhaps she thought this was the miracle her mother had been waiting for. Sneaking out of the church, Sophia ran through the hot streets of New York, her thoughts a whirlwind of hope and fear. What would this mean for her and her mother? How would Elizabeth react to this news? Meanwhile, Edward was leaving the church, his body relieved by the confession, but his mind tormented by the magnitude of what he was about to face. He knew the next 24 hours would change the course of his life forever. His marriage, his career, his reputation, everything was at stake. What Edward didn't know was that, at that very moment, a little girl was running through the streets of New York, carrying a secret that was about to turn his world upside down. Fate had intertwined their lives once again, and there was no turning back. As the sun began to set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, both Edward and Sophia were heading home, each carrying the weight of a revelation that would change their lives forever. The stage was set for a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the transformative power of truth. The New York twilight painted the sky in shades of orange as Sophia finally reached her neighborhood on the outskirts. Breathless and with a racing heart, the girl ran through the narrow alleys until she reached the small shack she called home. The worn wooden walls and zinc roof contrasted sharply with the opulence of the church she had left behind. "Mom! Mom!" Sophia shouted, rushing through the door. Elizabeth, a woman in her early 30s, struggled to rise from the worn couch, where she had been resting. Her pale face and sunken eyes betrayed the illness that had been consuming her for months. "What is it, my dear? Why all this commotion?" Elizabeth asked, concerned about the girl's state. Sophia, still panting, began to recount everything she had witnessed at the church. The words tumbled out in a whirlwind, mixing with the emotion and confusion she felt. "Mom, I think I found my father. He was at the church, talking to a priest. He mentioned your name and talked about leaving a pregnant woman 7 years ago." Elizabeth grew even paler, if that was possible. She sat back down, her legs trembling. "Sophia, my love, calm down. You must have misunderstood. Edward, he's part of a past I decided to leave behind." But Sophia insisted, describing in detail what she had heard. With every word, Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. The memories she had tried to bury for so long resurfaced with overwhelming force. "Daughter, I understand your excitement, but we can't rush into this. Many things have happened and situations aren't always as simple as they seem." Elizabeth tried to calm her daughter, but her voice trembled. Sophia, however, was not willing to let the matter die. "But Mom, what if it's true? What if he can help us? You're sick, we need money for your treatment." Elizabeth sighed deeply, feeling the weight of her daughter's words. She knew her condition was worsening, and the resources for treatment were scarce, but the thought of confronting Edward after so many years terrified her. "Sophia, things aren't that simple. Edward made his choice a long time ago. We can't just show up in his life now and demand help." The girl, however, had already made up her mind. Without her mother knowing, she planned to return to the church the next day. Determined to get answers, Sophia knew this might be the only chance to change her family's fate. Meanwhile, across the city, Edward arrived at his luxurious apartment on Fifth Avenue. The contrast between the simplicity of the church and the sophistication of his residence was striking. Crystals, artwork, and designer furniture composed a scene that screamed success and wealth. Marianne, his fiancée, was waiting for him in the living room. Tall, elegant, and with a carefully rehearsed smile, she was the epitome of the perfect woman in the eyes of society. "Darling, where have you been? We have the rehearsal dinner in 2 hours," she said, her voice sweet but with a note of impatience. Edward felt a knot form in his throat. How could he tell her about Elizabeth, about the child he had abandoned? How could he explain that the future they had planned together was about to crumble? "Marianne, we need to talk," he began, his voice trembling slightly. Marianne's expression changed instantly, her smile disappearing. "What's wrong, Edward? You're scaring me." Edward took a deep breath, gathering courage. "There's something I need to tell you. Something from my past that could change everything." As he began to recount his story, Marianne's face went through a myriad of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger. "How could you hide this from me all this time?" she exploded, tears of anger welling up in her eyes. "On the eve of our wedding, you tell me you might have a child out there?" "I don't know if I have a child, Marianne. I never knew what happened to Elizabeth after I ran away," Edward tried to explain, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. Marianne stood up abruptly, her body trembling with anger. "You're a coward, Edward, a coward and a liar. How do you expect me to trust you after this?" Marianne's words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He knew he deserved every one of them, but it still hurt to hear the truth so bluntly. "I understand your anger, Marianne, but I needed to be honest with you before the wedding. I couldn't keep carrying this secret." Marianne laughed bitterly. "Honest? Now? After all these years?" "No, Edward. Honesty would have been telling me this when we started our relationship." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward could feel the weight of his actions, the cost of his lies. Everything he had built over the past few years, his relationship. With Marianne, his reputation, his carefully planned life was crumbling before his eyes. "What do you intend to do now?" Marianne finally asked, her voice cold and distant. Edward hesitated. He knew what he needed to do, but saying it out loud would make it all too real. "I need to find Elizabeth. I need to know what happened. If I have a child." Marianne nodded slowly, her tears drying, replaced by an expression of determination. "Then go, Edward. Find your answers. But know that when you return, I won't be here waiting for you." With those words, she removed the engagement ring and placed it on the coffee table. The metallic sound of the ring hitting the glass echoed through the apartment, sealing the end of a chapter in Edward Thompson's life. As Marianne left the apartment, Edward found himself alone, confronting the weight of his past choices and the uncertainty of the future that awaited him. Tomorrow, he knew, would be the day he faced his demons, the day he might finally meet the son or daughter he had abandoned before they were even born. Across town, Sophia drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with images of a father she had never known but who now seemed so close and yet so far away. Fate had set the gears in motion, and there was no turning back. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would forever change the lives of Edward, Elizabeth, and Sophia. Morning arrived in New York with a thin mist covering the streets, as if the city itself was trying to hide the secrets about to come to light. Edward woke up early after a restless night. His tired eyes reflected in the mirror the anguish of someone carrying an immense burden on their shoulders. He dressed mechanically, opting for simpler clothes than his usual suit. Today was not a day for masks or appearances. It was the day of truth, no matter how painful it might be. Meanwhile, in the small shack on the outskirts, Sophia was also preparing. She had lied to her mother, saying she was going to school. Elizabeth, still weakened by the conversation the day before and the illness consuming her, didn't have the strength to question her daughter. "Be careful, my love," Elizabeth said, kissing the girl's forehead. "And remember, things aren't always what they seem." Sophia nodded, feeling a pang of guilt for deceiving her mother. But in her childlike heart, she believed she was doing the right thing. This might be the chance to save her mother, to have the family she had always dreamed of. The streets of New York were already pulsing with the characteristic energy of the metropolis when Sophia arrived at St. Cecilia's Church. Her heart raced, a mix of fear and anticipation. She hid behind a pillar, watching the church entrance, waiting to see the man she believed to be her father. It didn't take long for Edward to appear. He walked hesitantly, as if each step required monumental effort. Sophia watched him for a few moments, gathering courage. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her hiding place and stood in his path. "Are you Edward Thompson?" she asked, her voice small but firm. Edward stopped, surprised by the unexpected approach. He looked at the girl, noticing her curious and determined eyes. "Yes, it's me. And you, who are you?" Sophia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "My name is Sophia. I think you're my father." The world seemed to stop for Edward. He looked at the girl, truly seeing her for the first time. The eyes, the shape of her face. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't deny. How do you know that?" he managed to ask, his voice almost a whisper. "I heard you yesterday talking to the priest. About Elizabeth. About leaving a pregnant woman 7 years ago." "My mother's name is Elizabeth, and I'm 7 years old." Edward felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the church wall, trying to process the information. The reality of his past actions hit him with full force. "Where is your mother, Sophia?" he asked, his voice trembling. "At home, she's sick, we need help," Sophia replied, the worry evident in her voice. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to compose himself. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze. "Take me to her, please," he requested. The walk to Elizabeth's shack was silent. Edward watched the city change. Around him, the wide tree-lined streets giving way to narrow alleys and crowded houses. It was a world completely different from his own, a world he had ignored for so long. When they finally arrived, Sophia hesitated at the door. "Mom doesn't know I came to look for you," she admitted. Edward nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "It's okay, Sophia. I will talk to her." Elizabeth was sitting in the small room when she heard the door open. "Sophia, what are you doing home so ear—" Her voice trailed off as she saw Edward standing in the doorway. Time seemed to freeze. Elizabeth and Edward stared at each other, years of hurt, regret, and unanswered questions hanging between them. "Elizabeth," Edward began, his voice choked. But before he could continue, Elizabeth stood up abruptly, a wave of dizziness hitting her. Edward rushed to support her, holding her before she could fall. "You shouldn't be here," Elizabeth said, her voice weak but filled with emotion. "Why did you come back now?" Edward helped her sit down again, aware of her fragile health. "I didn't know, Elizabeth. I swear I didn't know about Sophia, about your condition." "And does that make any difference now?" Elizabeth asked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Sophia watched the scene, torn between hope and fear. She hadn't expected the encounter to be so tense, so charged with emotions she barely understood. "It makes all the difference," Edward replied, his voice firm. "I know I made a terrible mistake in the past, but I'm here now. I want to help. I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "Be part of our lives, Edward. You have no idea what we've been through these 7 years. The sleepless nights, the days without food, the humiliations." Each word was like a stab to Edward. The reality of the consequences of his actions hit him with full force. "I know I can't change the past, Elizabeth, but I can try to do something for the future. Please, let me help with your treatment, with Sophia." Elizabeth looked at her daughter, who was watching everything with wide eyes. She knew that as much as she wanted to protect Sophia from pain, she couldn't deny the girl the chance to know her father. "It won't be easy, Edward," she finally said. "There's a lot of resentment, a lot of pain." Edward nodded, understanding the magnitude of the challenge ahead. "I know, but I'm willing to face it all. For you, for Sophia, and for myself." As the conversation continued, tense and emotionally charged, Sophia timidly approached Edward. Hesitant, she touched his hand. "Are you really going to stay?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Edward looked at the girl, feeling a wave of love and protectiveness he had never experienced before. "Yes, Sophia, I'm going to stay. I promise I won't abandon you again." Elizabeth watched the interaction, her heart torn between distrust and hope. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and painful conversations. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was the chance she had secretly always hoped for. Outside, the day progressed, the sun finally breaking through the morning haze. Inside the small shack, 3 lives that had been separated by fate and choices began to walk a new path together. It was the start of a journey of redemption, forgiveness, and who knows, a new chance for the family that never quite came to be. The days following the reunion were an emotional roller coaster for Edward, Elizabeth, and Sophia. The small shack on the outskirts of New York, once a quiet refuge for mother and daughter, now buzzed with Edward's constant presence and the hesitant attempts to establish a new family dynamic. Edward, determined to keep his promise, threw himself into the task of helping Elizabeth with her medical treatment. Using his contacts and financial resources, he managed to schedule appointments with renowned specialists and initiate a more comprehensive treatment plan for the illness that was consuming her. One particularly tense afternoon, Edward and Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table while Sophia played in the small backyard. "Elizabeth, I know it's hard to trust me after everything, but I need you to tell me more about your illness," Edward asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Elizabeth sighed, running her hand through her prematurely graying hair. The doctors were never sure of the exact cause. It started with chronic fatigue, joint pain. At first we thought it was stress, the exhaustion of raising a child alone. Edward felt the weight of guilt in her words but remained silent, allowing her to continue. "Over time the symptoms got worse. I had to leave my job at the factory. The doctors suspect some kind of exposure to toxic substances, but we never had the money for more detailed tests." The mention of the factory sparked something in Edward's memory. "What factory was that, Elizabeth?" "It was a chemical products company. It closed a few years ago, right after I left. There were rumors about illegal waste dumping, but nothing was ever proven." The businessman felt a chill run down his spine. He vaguely remembered hearing about that company. There had been rumors in the corporate world about questionable practices, but at the time, he'd been so focused on building his own empire that he hadn't paid much attention to it. "I'll look into this, Elizabeth. There might be a connection between your work there and your illness. If that's the case, we can seek compensation." Elizabeth looked at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. "Edward, I don't want you getting involved in something dangerous. We've already been through enough." "Don't worry," he assured her, gently holding her hand. "I'll do everything by the book. You and Sophia deserve justice." Meanwhile, in the world outside the small shack, Edward's life was undergoing drastic changes. His sudden absence and the abrupt cancellation of his wedding to Marianne had not gone unnoticed by New York's high society. Rumors began to circulate, fueled by the lack of official explanations. Some speculated about an extramarital affair, others about a nervous breakdown. The truth, however, was far more complex than anyone could imagine. In his office at the company, Edward faced curious glances and whispers from the employees. His assistant John hesitantly entered the room. "Mr. Thompson, there are reporters in the lobby. They're asking about the cancellation of your wedding and, well, about rumors of a secret family." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation. He knew he couldn't hide the truth for much longer, but he also wasn't ready to expose Elizabeth and Sophia to public scrutiny. "John, please tell them I'll make an official statement soon. For now, no comments." As John left, Edward received a message on his phone. It was from Renato, his former business partner. "Edward, we need to talk. I've heard some concerning rumors. Meet me at the usual cafe at 3 p.m. The tone of the message left Edward uneasy. Renato had always been an ambitious man and not always ethical in his business dealings. What could he want now? Deciding to tackle one problem at a time, Edward turned his attention to Sophia. The girl was adapting surprisingly well to the new situation, but he knew there was still a long way to go to build a true father-daughter relationship. That evening, Edward decided to take Sophia for a walk. They strolled through the neighborhood, with the girl proudly showing him her favorite spots, the small square where she played with her friends, the corner ice cream shop, and the school she attended. "Daddy," Sophia said hesitantly, testing the word, "are you going to live with us now?" Edward felt his heart tighten at the innocent question. I don't know yet, Sophia, but I promise I'll always be around, okay?" The girl nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. As they walked back home, Edward couldn't help but notice the curious glances from the neighbors. His presence there, clearly a man from a different social reality, didn't go unnoticed. Back at the small house, Elizabeth was waiting for them, with a simple but lovingly prepared dinner. The domestic scene, so different from the luxurious life Edward had led just days ago, made him reflect on his priorities and values. "How was the walk?" Elizabeth asked as she served the soup. "It was great, Mom," Sophia replied excitedly. "Daddy bought me ice cream and met Mrs. Mary from the grocery store." Elizabeth gave Edward a meaningful look. "Daddy, huh? You two seem to be getting along well." Edward felt the weight of that word. Daddy, father, a responsibility he had avoided for so long and now embraced with his whole being. "We're learning together," he replied softly. Later, with Sophia already asleep, Edward and Elizabeth talked in hushed tones in the small living room. "Edward, I know you're trying, but this is all so sudden. Sophia is excited now, but I'm afraid she'll get hurt if I leave again," Edward finished, guilt evident in his voice. "I understand your fear, Elizabeth, but I swear I won't abandon you both again. I'm here to stay, no matter what." Elizabeth studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity in his eyes. "I hope so, Edward, because now it's not just my heart at stake, it's Sophia's too." As the night deepened, Edward prepared to return to his apartment. The duality of his life, divided between the luxury he was accustomed to and the warm simplicity of that small home, weighed heavily on his mind. Tomorrow would be another day of challenges. The meeting with Renato, the media pressures, the responsibilities with his company. All of it seemed small compared to the monumental task of regaining Elizabeth's trust and building a relationship with his daughter. As he left, Edward glanced back, seeing the soft light emanating from the shack's window. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do everything in his power to protect and care for this family he had almost lost. With determined steps, Edward walked through the New York night, leaving behind the man he was and embracing the man he needed to become. The coffee shop in downtown New York buzzed with the typical hustle of a business afternoon. Executives in expensive suits discussed contracts, while young entrepreneurs tapped furiously on their laptops. Edward entered the establishment, his eyes scanning the room until he found Renato, seated at a table in the back. Renato smiled as he saw Edward approach, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Edward, my old friend, it's been a while." "Renato," Edward greeted, sitting down. "What's so urgent?" Renato took a sip of his coffee before answering. "I've heard some interesting rumors about you. A secret family? A cancelled wedding? It's not typical of the great Edward Thompson to cause so much commotion." Edward felt his stomach churn. The way Renato spoke with that slightly threatening tone made him uneasy. "My personal life is none of your business, Renato." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken, my dear." Renato leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You see, that factory, where your, let's say, little girlfriend worked, I bought it just before it closed." Edward's blood ran cold. The connection he feared was beginning to materialize. "What are you implying?" "Nothing, nothing." Renato raised his hands in a gesture of false innocence. "I just think it would be a shame if the press found out about your colorful past. Imagine the headlines. Tycoon abandons pregnant woman, years later discovers son in slum. That wouldn't look good for your image, would it?" Edward felt the anger rising within him. "Are you blackmailing me, Renato?" "Blackmail is such an ugly word," Renato smiled. "I prefer to call it a mutual agreement. You keep your nose out of my old business, and I keep your reputation intact. Simple as that." Edward stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This isn't going to end here, Renato. You have no idea what you're messing with." As he left the cafe, Edward's mind raced. The connection between Elizabeth's illness and the factory now seemed clear, but the implications were terrifying. Renato wasn't just an unscrupulous businessman, he was dangerous. Back in his office, Edward found a stack of messages and missed calls. His assistant, John, hurried in. "Mr. Thompson, the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the rumors and the impact on the company." Edward sighed, massaging his temples. "Schedule it for tomorrow morning, John, and please cancel all my appointments for this afternoon. I need to take care of something personal." Determined to protect Elizabeth and Sophia, Edward headed to the office of an old friend, the lawyer Charles Mendez. After explaining the situation, omitting some of the more sensitive details, Edward asked, "Charles, what can we do?" The lawyer thought for a moment. "It's a delicate situation, Edward. We need to proceed carefully. First, we must ensure the safety of Elizabeth and Sophia. Then we can start investigating the factory's practices and possible negligence. What about Renato? He's playing a dangerous game, Charles replied. Blackmail is a crime. If we can gather evidence, we can turn the tables on him. While discussing strategies, Edward received a message from Elizabeth. Sophia has a fever. I'm worried. Without hesitation, Edward said goodbye to Charles and rushed to the shack. When he arrived, he found Elizabeth holding Sophia, who was trembling with fever. She suddenly started feeling unwell, Elizabeth explained, the fear evident in her voice. Edward picked up Sophia, feeling the heat radiating from her small body. Let's take her to the hospital now. In the car, on the way to the nearest private hospital, Edward couldn't help but think about how drastically his life had changed in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, his biggest concern was which tie to wear to an important meeting. Now, he held in his arms a daughter he barely knew, praying that she would be okay. At the hospital, while the doctors examined Sophia, Edward and Elizabeth anxiously waited in the waiting room. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken worries. Elizabeth, Edward finally spoke, there's something I need to tell you about the factory where you worked. He then recounted his conversation with Renato, the suspicions about the company's illegal practices, and the possible connection to Elizabeth's illness. With each word, Elizabeth's face grew paler. So, all this time, my illness? She murmured, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Edward held her hand, feeling a mix of guilt and determination. We'll fight this, Elizabeth. Together. I won't let Renato or anyone else get away with this. At that moment, the doctor appeared, interrupting the conversation. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson? Edward and Elizabeth quickly stood up, concern etched on their faces. Sophia is responding well to treatment. The fever was caused by an infection, but with the right antibiotics, she'll be fine in a few days, the doctor explained. The relief they felt was almost palpable. Edward instinctively hugged Elizabeth, both of them shedding tears of relief. Can we see her? Elizabeth asked. The doctor nodded, guiding them to the room where Sophia was resting. The girl was pale, but smiled weakly as she saw her parents enter. Mom, Dad, she called, her voice small. Edward felt his heart tighten as he heard Sophia call him Dad for the first time. In that moment, he knew he would do anything to protect his family. While Elizabeth gently stroked Sophia's hair, Edward looked out the hospital window, observing the city that stretched out before him. Out there, somewhere, Renato was plotting his dark schemes. The press eagerly awaited a scandal. His company faced uncertainties. But there, in that hospital room, Edward found a clarity he had never experienced before. He knew the challenges ahead would be immense, but for the first time in his life, he felt he was fighting for something that truly mattered. With a deep sigh, Edward turned his attention back to Sophia and Elizabeth. The future was uncertain, but he was determined to face it head-on, protecting those he now knew were the true treasures of his life. The days following Sophia's hospitalization were a whirlwind of emotions and challenges for Edward. Torn between the hospital, where he spent most of his time with Elizabeth and their daughter, and the mounting pressures of his professional life, he found himself at a crossroads that demanded difficult and courageous decisions. On a particularly tense morning, Edward arrived at the office for the awaited meeting with the board of directors. The atmosphere was heavy, with suspicious glances and whispers that abruptly ceased as he entered the meeting room. Richard Mendez, the chairman of the board, was the first to speak. Edward, I believe you know why we're here. The rumors about your personal life are affecting investor confidence. We need explanations. Edward took a deep breath, adjusting his tie. It was time to face the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the concern, and you deserve to know the truth. With the honesty that surprised even himself, Edward told the whole story. His past with Elizabeth, the abandonment, the recent discovery of Sophia, and Elizabeth's illness. As he spoke, he could see the expressions change from shock to understanding, and in some cases even sympathy. I know my personal life has impacted the company, and for that I apologize. But I also want you to know that I am committed to resolving this situation in the most ethical and transparent way possible. There was a moment of silence after his speech. Finally, Mary Oliver, one of the most respected directors, spoke. "Edward, we appreciate your honesty. But how do you plan to handle the press and public opinion?" "With the truth," Edward replied firmly. "I will make an official statement taking responsibility and explaining the situation. I believe transparency is the best path forward." The meeting continued for a few more hours, discussing strategies to handle the image crisis and potential impacts on the business. By the end, although concerns still lingered, Edward felt he had regained some of the board's trust. As he left the meeting, Edward was surprised by John, his assistant, who seemed agitated. "Mr. Thompson, there's a woman waiting in your office. She said it's urgent and, well, she introduced herself as Marianne." Edward's heart raced. Marianne, his ex-fiancée, the woman he had left without proper explanations when this whole situation began to unfold. He knew this confrontation was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Upon entering his office, he found Marianne standing, looking out the window. She turned as she heard him enter, her eyes a mix of anger and hurt. "Marianne." "No, Edward. Now you're going to listen to me," she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't have the decency to explain anything to me. I had to find out about your family through gossip and media speculation." Edward felt the weight of guilt. "You're right. I should have been honest with you from the start. I'm sorry." Marianne laughed bitterly. "You're sorry? Edward, we were going to get married. We had plans, a life plan together, and you threw it all away for a woman and a child you didn't even know." "I know it seems crazy, Marianne, but when I found out about Sophia, about Elizabeth, I couldn't." "Just ignore it. They are my responsibility, my family. And me? What was I to you?" Marianne asked, tears now streaming down her face. Edward stepped closer, hesitant. You are important to me, Marianne. But this situation has made me realize many things about myself, about the man I want to be." Marianne stared at him for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "You've really changed, haven't you? The Edward I knew would never have taken on such a responsibility. I'm trying to be better, Marianne, for Sophia, for Elizabeth, for myself." There was a tense silence between them. Finally, Marianne wiped away her tears and headed for the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "I hope it's worth it, Edward. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for." With those words, she left, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. He sat heavily in his chair, his head spinning with everything that had happened in the past few weeks. His phone vibrated, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Elizabeth. "Sophia has been discharged. We're heading home." An involuntary smile appeared on his lips. Despite all the challenges, there was light at the end of the tunnel. His family was waiting for him. Edward quickly gathered his things and left the office, determined to be there for Sophia and Elizabeth. On the way, he stopped at a flower shop, buying a colorful bouquet to brighten up the small house. When he arrived, he found Elizabeth helping Sophia settle on the couch. The girl was still pale, but her eyes lit up when she saw Edward. "Daddy, you came!" Sophia exclaimed, stretching out her arms for a hug. Edward hugged her gently, feeling a wave of love and protection he had never experienced before. "Of course I came, Princess. How are you feeling?" As Sophia chatted about her stay in the hospital and the cartoons she watched, Edward exchanged a meaningful glance with Elizabeth. There was so much to say, so many things to resolve, but at that moment all that mattered was being together. Later, with Sophia asleep, Edward and Elizabeth spoke in hushed tones in the small kitchen. "How was the meeting?" Elizabeth asked, concern evident in her voice. Edward sighed. "It was intense, but I think I managed to explain the situation. I'll make an official statement in the next few days." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "And what about that man, Renato?" Edward's expression hardened. "I'm working on it. My lawyer is investigating the factory and Renato's practices. I won't let him get away with this, Elizabeth. He's going to pay for what he did to you, to all the others who might have been affected. Elizabeth gently touched Edward's arm. Just be careful, please. I don't want you or Sophia to get hurt because of this. Edward covered her hand with his, feeling a connection that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. I promise I'll be careful, but I also promise I'll fight for you, for our family. That night, as Edward prepared to leave, he stopped at the door of Sophia's room, watching the girl sleep peacefully. The moonlight streamed through the window, softly illuminating her face. In just a few days, his life had been turned upside down. He had lost things he once considered important: his engagement, part of his reputation, the unconditional trust of his peers. But there, looking at his daughter, Edward realized he had gained something far more valuable. With one last glance at Elizabeth, who watched him from the hallway, Edward stepped out into the New York night. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and potential dangers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive, truly committed to something greater than himself. As he walked, Edward made a silent promise to the stars shining above the city. He would be the man, the father, and the partner that Sophia and Elizabeth deserved, and nothing, not Renato, not the press, not the ghosts of his past, would stop him from keeping that promise. The sun had barely risen when Edward was awakened by an urgent call from his lawyer, Charles Mendez. The voice on the other end of the line was tense, filled with worry. "Edward, we have a problem. Renato is making moves. He filed a lawsuit against you, claiming defamation and attempted corporate sabotage." Edward sat up abruptly in bed, his sleep vanishing instantly. "What? But that's absurd. We haven't even gone public yet." "Exactly," Charles replied. "He's trying to get ahead, creating a smokescreen to divert attention from the investigations into the factory. And there's more. He's using your history with Elizabeth and Sophia as ammunition, painting you as unstable and unreliable." Edward's stomach churned. He knew Renato was dangerous, but he didn't expect such a direct and swift attack. "What can we do, Charles?" "For now, we need to be cautious. I'll work on our legal defense, but you need to prepare for the media circus that's coming. Renato will try to destroy your reputation in every way possible." After hanging up, Edward sat on the bed for a few minutes, trying to process the situation. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. It seemed the news was already spreading quickly. With a heavy sigh, he got up and prepared to face the day. His first stop would be Elizabeth and Sophia's place. He needed to warn them about what was coming. When he arrived, he found Elizabeth already awake, preparing breakfast for Sophia. The girl was still recovering, but already showing more energy. "Edward, what's wrong? You look worried," Elizabeth asked as soon as she saw him come in. He quickly explained the situation, trying not to alarm Sophia, who was distractedly playing with her cereal. Elizabeth paled as Edward spoke. "My God, Edward, this is serious. What are we going to do?" Edward held Elizabeth's hand, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "We'll face this together. But I need you all to be prepared. The press will likely try to get in touch, ask questions. It's important that we are careful with what we say." Sophia, sensing the tension in the air, looked at the two with wide eyes. "Daddy, is something bad going to happen?" Edward knelt beside his daughter, smiling gently. "Don't worry, Princess. We're just sorting out some grown-up problems. You just need to focus on getting better, okay?" Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Renato smiled contentedly in his luxurious office. His plan was in motion. He knew Edward was a threat to his shady business dealings and was determined to eliminate him before he could cause more damage. "Mr. Oliveira," his secretary interrupted his thoughts. "The reporter Camila Souza is here for the interview." Renato adjusted his tie, preparing to take the next step in his plan. "Great, show her in." Camila Souza, a journalist known for her relentless investigative reporting, entered the room. Renato greeted her with a calculated smile. "Miss Souza, what a pleasure to have you here. I'm looking forward to clearing up all the misunderstandings about this unfortunate situation with Mr. Thompson." The ensuing interview was a masterpiece of manipulation. Renato painted Edward as an irresponsible businessman who abandoned a pregnant woman and was now using his supposed family to attack competitors and divert attention from his own business failures. Meanwhile, Edward spent the day in frantic meetings with his public relations team and lawyers, trying to devise a strategy to contain the damage. The news of Renato's lawsuit was already in all the newspapers, and speculation was running wild. By late afternoon, exhausted and with a throbbing headache, Edward received an unexpected call. It was Marianne. "Edward, I saw the news. Is this true? Is Renato really suing you?" Marianne's voice sounded worried, almost regretful. Edward felt a pang of emotion upon hearing his ex-fiancée. "It's true, Marianne, but it's not how Renato is painting it. There's much more to this story." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "I believe you, Edward. I know Renato. I know what he's capable of. If you need help, someone to vouch for your character, well, I'm here." Marianne's offer caught Edward by surprise. After everything that had happened between them, he hadn't expected this support. "Thank you, Marianne. This means a lot to me." After hanging up, Edward felt a renewed determination. He wasn't alone in this battle. He had Elizabeth, Sophia, and now even Marianne by his side. It was time to fight back. That night, Edward did something many would consider risky. He decided to give an exclusive interview telling his side of the story. He chose a respected journalist, known for his integrity. Sitting in the studio under the bright lights of the cameras, Edward took a deep breath and began to speak. He told everything: his past with Elizabeth, the fear that drove him to flee, the recent discovery of Sophia, and the suspicions about Renato's illegal practices. "I know I made mistakes in the past," Edward said, looking directly into the camera, "and I'm doing everything I can to make them right now. But this move by Renato isn't about me or my family. It's about hiding the truth about dangerous and illegal business practices that may have harmed countless people." The interview aired that same night, causing a media frenzy. Social media exploded with divided opinions, some supporting Edward for his honesty, others criticizing his past actions. As the media storm unfolded, Edward returned to the small shack where Elizabeth and Sophia were waiting for him. As he entered, he was greeted by a tight hug from his daughter. "Daddy, you were on TV. You looked so brave." Edward smiled, feeling his heart warm with Sophia's unconditional support. Elizabeth approached, her face a mix of concern and admiration. "Are you sure you did the right thing, Edward? Exposing everything like this?" He nodded, pulling Elizabeth into a hug along with Sophia. "It was the only thing to do. We can't let Renato control the narrative. And more importantly, we can't let him keep harming innocent people." That night, as the city buzzed with the revelations, Edward, Elizabeth, and Sophia shared a moment of peace in their little refuge. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since it all began, Edward felt they had a real chance of winning. On the other side of the city, Renato watched Edward's interview, his face twisted in anger. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he rarely used. "Change of plans," he growled to the person on the other end. "Edward Thompson needs to be silenced permanently." The pieces on the board were moving, and the game was about to become much more dangerous. The days following Edward's interview were a roller coaster of emotions and events. The city of New York seemed divided. On one side, those who admired Edward's courage in exposing the truth. On the other, the skeptics who questioned his motives and his past. Amidst this turmoil, an unexpected figure emerged as Edward's ally, Dr. Lucy Santos, a former employee of the factory Renato had bought. She reached out to Charles Mendez, Edward's lawyer, offering crucial information about the company's illegal practices. On a rainy afternoon, Edward met with Lucy at a discreet cafe in the city center. The middle-aged woman with a tired look seemed nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice low and trembling. "What I have to tell you could change everything, but you need to understand the risks. Renato Oliveira isn't just an unscrupulous businessman, he has dangerous connections." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of Lucy's words. "I understand, Dr. Santos, and I appreciate your courage in coming to speak with me. Please, tell me what you know." Lucy then unfolded a shocking story of environmental negligence, bribes to inspectors, and an elaborate scheme to cover up the damage caused by the factory's chemicals. Even more alarming, she revealed that Elizabeth wasn't the only victim. Dozens of former employees and residents around the factory had developed similar health issues. "We have documents, Mr. Thompson, internal reports, test results that were suppressed. Renato paid a lot of money to keep all of this secret." Edward felt a mix of horror and determination growing inside him. It's monstrous. "Dr. Santos, we need to take this information to the authorities immediately." Lucy agreed, but her expression remained apprehensive. "I've tried to do that before, Mr. Thompson, but Renato has friends in high places. Every time I tried to report it, I was silenced. I lost my job, I was threatened. This time will be different," Edward assured, placing a comforting hand on Lucy's. "We have resources, we have visibility. We won't let Renato get away with it again." Meanwhile, in Elizabeth's small shack, a different scene was unfolding. Sophia, recovered from her illness, was playing happily in the backyard under Elizabeth's watchful eye. The tranquility of the scene was interrupted by insistent knocking at the door. Elizabeth opened it, facing a tall, serious-looking man. "Mrs. Elizabeth, my name is Mark Silvera. I'm a private investigator. I've been hired to investigate the case involving you, your daughter, and Mr. Edward Thompson." Elizabeth's heart raced. "Investigate? By whom?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "I can't reveal my client, ma'am, but I believe it's in your best interest to talk to me. I have information that could directly affect your daughter's well-being." Elizabeth glanced nervously at Sophia, who continued playing, oblivious to the tension building. Reluctantly, she invited Mark inside. The conversation that followed left Elizabeth shaken. Mark hinted that he had discovered inconsistencies in Edward's story, suggesting that he might be using Elizabeth and Sophia as part of a larger scheme to target Renato. "Think carefully, Mrs. Elizabeth," Mark said softly. "A wealthy and powerful man like Edward Thompson, suddenly interested in a family he abandoned years ago? Don't you find that a bit too convenient?" Elizabeth felt her world spin. The doubts she had managed to push away over the past few weeks came rushing back with full force. What if Edward was just using them? What if it was all just an elaborate manipulation? Across town, Edward left his meeting with Lucy, his heart heavy with the revelations but determined to act. He called Elizabeth, eager to share the news and discuss the next steps. But Elizabeth's voice on the other end of the line was cold, distant. "Edward, I think it's best if you don't come today. We need some time to think about all of this." The sudden change in tone caught Edward off guard. "Elizabeth, what's wrong? Did something happen?" "Nothing happened, Edward," Elizabeth replied, her voice trembling. I just need some time, okay? For Sophia's sake." Before Edward could argue, Elizabeth hung up. He stared at the phone, feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, as rain fell over New York, 3 scenes unfolded simultaneously. Edward, in his apartment, surrounded by documents and evidence, worked frantically with Charles to build a solid case against Renato, his heart torn between the legal battle and his concern over Elizabeth's strange behavior. Elizabeth, sitting in the small room of her shack, watched Sophia sleeping peacefully, her heart torn between the love she was beginning to feel for Edward and the doubts planted by Mark. And in his luxurious office, Renato smiled with satisfaction, a glass of whiskey in hand, as he listened to Mark Silvera's report over the phone. His plan to sow discord between Edward and Elizabeth was working perfectly. "Excellent work, Mark," Renato said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Keep the pressure on. I want Edward Thompson completely isolated before we deliver the final blow." The night wore on, and with it the dark clouds of the approaching storm. Edward, Elizabeth, and Sophia were in the eye of the hurricane, and the forces surrounding them were about to collide catastrophically. The next morning dawned grey. In New York, as if the sky itself reflected the tension hanging over the city. Edward, who had barely slept, was awakened by an urgent call from his lawyer, Charles Mendez. "Edward, we have a serious problem." Charles's voice sounded tense. "Someone leaked confidential information about our case to the press. The accusations against Renato are in all the newspapers, but mixed with lies and distortions about you and your family. Edward's heart raced. He turned on the television and was bombarded by sensationalist headlines. Tycoon uses abandoned family as shield. Environmental scandal or personal vendetta. The dark past of Edward Thompson. Meanwhile, in Elizabeth's shack, the situation wasn't much different. Neighbors knocked on the door, some offering support, others asking intrusive questions. Sophia, confused and scared, clung to her mother. "Mommy, why is everyone talking about us? Where's Daddy?" Elizabeth, trying to stay calm for her daughter, didn't know how to respond. The doubts planted by Mark Silvera still echoed in her mind, now mingling with the confusion caused by the news. It was in this moment of chaos that an unexpected figure appeared at Elizabeth's door. Marianne, Edward's ex-fiancée. "Elizabeth, can we talk?" Marianne asked, her face a mix of determination and nervousness. Hesitant, Elizabeth let Marianne in. The two women faced each other, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. "I know you must be confused and scared," Marianne began, "but I came here because I believe you need to know the truth about Edward." Elizabeth braced herself for the worst, but what followed completely surprised her. Marianne spoke of the Edward she had known, a dedicated, ethical man who always cared for others. She talked about how the discovery of Sophia and Elizabeth had deeply changed him, awakening in him a sense of responsibility and love she had never seen before. "I know he made mistakes in the past, Elizabeth, mistakes that hurt both of you deeply. But the Edward I know now, the man he has become, he truly loves you. He's not using anyone." Marianne's words struck Elizabeth like a bolt of clarity in the storm of doubts. Tears began to stream down her face. "But what about all these news stories, the accusations?" Marianne sighed. "Renato is a dangerous and influential man. He will do everything to destroy Edward and protect his dirty secrets, including manipulating the truth and the people around you." At that moment, Elizabeth's phone rang. It was Lucy Santos, the former factory worker Edward had mentioned. "Elizabeth, my name is Lucy. I'm taking a huge risk by calling you, but you need to know the truth about what happened at that factory." In the following minutes, Lucy unraveled a horrifying tale of corporate negligence, evidence concealment, and shattered lives. Elizabeth listened in horror as she confirmed that her illness was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger and more sinister scheme. "Edward is fighting not just for you and Sophia, Elizabeth," Lucy concluded. "He's fighting for all of Renato's victims, and he's risking everything to do it." When the call ended, Elizabeth found herself facing Marianne, who looked at her with understanding and solidarity. Two women who, under different circumstances, might have been rivals, now united by the truth and their concern for Edward. "What are we going to do?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling but determined. Marianne smiled, a smile of someone ready for battle. "We're going to help Edward expose the truth. All of us." Meanwhile, in the city center, Edward faced an impromptu press conference in front of his office. Journalists shouted questions, camera flashes exploded, and microphones were thrust in his direction. With a heavy heart but a steady voice, Edward began to speak. "I know many of you have questions about my past, about my motivations. Yes, I've made mistakes. Mistakes I deeply regret, and for which I'm doing everything I can to make amends. But this story is much bigger than me, Elizabeth, or Sophia." He then began to detail the evidence they had gathered about Renato's illegal practices, environmental negligence, and the lives affected. As he spoke, the crowd's murmurs faded, replaced by an attentive and shocked silence. "I'm here today not to defend myself, but to give a voice to those who have been silenced for so long. The victims of corporate greed, the families destroyed by the relentless pursuit of profit. It's for them that I'm fighting. It's for them that we all must fight." As Edward finished his speech, a car screeched to a halt behind the crowd. Elizabeth, Sophia and Marianne stepped out, making their way through the journalists. As he saw his family approaching, Edward felt his heart skip a beat. For a moment, all the chaos around him disappeared. Only they existed. Elizabeth was the first to speak, her voice amplified by the microphones around her. "Everything Edward said is true. We are here to support him, to fight alongside him for justice." Sophia, holding her mother's hand firmly, looked at the cameras. With a courage surprising for her age, "My father is not a bad man. He's trying to make things right. Please believe in him." The moving scene of the family united, along with Marianne's unexpected testimony, created a wave of emotion among those present. The aggressive questions gave way to a respectful silence, broken only by the clicks of cameras. At that moment, as Edward embraced Elizabeth and Sophia with Marianne by his side offering her silent support, something shifted in the air. The narrative was turning. The truth, so often suffocated by power and money, was beginning to emerge. Across the city, in his luxurious office, Renato watched the scene on television, his face twisted in a mask of fury. He grabbed the phone, dialing furiously. "Plan B," he growled to the person on the other end of the line. "Now." The battle had reached a critical point. The truth was coming to light, but the danger had never been greater. Edward, Elizabeth, Sophia and their allies were about to face the ultimate test of their courage and determination. The sun set over New York, casting long shadows across the city's skyscrapers. In Edward's office, a tense meeting was unfolding. Edward, Elizabeth, Marianne, Charles Mendez, and Lucy Santos discussed the next steps. The atmosphere was one of determination mixed with apprehension. "The evidence we have is solid," Charles explained, spreading documents across the table. "With Lucy's testimony and the records we obtained, we have a strong case against Renato and his company." Edward nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "The problem is that Renato won't give up easily. He has too much to lose." As if to confirm his words, Edward's phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "Give up now or face the consequences. Last chance." Elizabeth, noticing Edward's somber expression, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together. Remember, we won't back down now." Marianne, who was watching the scene with a mix of admiration and a tinge of sadness, added, "I can help. I have contacts in the press who can ensure the truth gets out, no matter what Renato tries to do." As the group discussed strategies, Sophia slept peacefully on the office couch, unaware of the danger surrounding them. Edward looked at his daughter, feeling a wave of determination wash over him. He would fight not just for justice, but for Sophia's future. The next morning, the city woke up to a bombshell. Headlines in every newspaper and news outlet detailing Renato's illegal practices, the environmental damage caused by his company, and the victims who had suffered in silence for years. Cornered, Renato decided to play his final card. He called an emergency press conference, determined to turn the situation around. The lobby of the luxurious hotel where the press conference was to be held was packed with journalists and cameras. Renato took the stage, his face a mask of manufactured indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice laden with false emotion, "I come to you today as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by Edward Thompson, a man driven by revenge and unchecked ambition." As Renato spoke, painting himself as the honest businessman unfairly accused, Edward and his team watched from a nearby parked car. The plan was to wait for the right moment to make their entrance. "Now," Charles said, checking his watch. Edward took a deep breath, exchanging one last glance with Elizabeth before stepping out of the car. Together they entered the hotel, accompanied by Lucy, who was trembling slightly but remained steadfast. The group's entrance caused a stir in the audience. Renato, caught off guard, stammered for a moment before regaining his composure. "Ah, Mr. Thompson, how convenient of you to show up. Have you come to witness your defeat up close?" Edward stepped onto the stage, his face serious but determined. "No, Renato, I've come to ensure the truth is heard, the whole truth." With a nod, Edward signaled for Lucy to step forward. The former employee, summoning all her courage, began to recount her experience at the factory, detailing the illegal practices, the covered-up accidents, the lives destroyed. As Lucy spoke, Renato's face grew paler and paler. He tried to interrupt, to call for security, but the journalists present, sensing the weight of the unfolding story, prevented any interference. Edward then took the floor, his firm voice echoing through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are hearing today is not just about me or my family. It's about all the Elizabeths, all the Sophias who have suffered in silence for years. It's about corporate greed that destroys lives in the name of profit. As Edward spoke, Elizabeth noticed a suspicious movement at the back of the hall. A man with his hand inside his coat was quickly approaching the stage. In a flash of understanding and horror, she realized what was about to happen. "Edward, watch out!" she shouted, running toward him. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The man drew a gun, aiming it at Edward. Elizabeth threw herself in front of him just as the shot was fired. Chaos erupted in the hall. Screams, people running, cameras falling. Edward held Elizabeth. In his arms, horrified to see the blood spreading across her blouse. "Elizabeth, no. Please, no," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. The hotel security quickly subdued the shooter, who was shouting incoherent accusations against Edward and Renato. Renato, taking advantage of the confusion, tried to escape but was stopped by Charles and some alert journalists. Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing Elizabeth to the hospital. Edward, in shock, went with her in the ambulance, holding her hand the entire time. The hours that followed were a blur of hospital corridors, hurried doctors, and the anguish of waiting. Marianne arrived with Sophia, who was crying in fear, not fully understanding what had happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor came out of the operating room. "Mr. Thompson, your wife is stable. The bullet didn't hit any. Vital organs, she will recover." The relief that flooded Edward was almost physical. He hugged Sophia tightly, both crying with joy and relief. In the days that followed, as Elizabeth recovered in the hospital, events unfolded quickly. Renato was arrested, charged not only with environmental and corporate crimes, but also with attempted murder. The investigations revealed a web of corruption that extended across various levels of power. The story of Edward, Elizabeth, and Sophia captured the public's imagination. From villain, Edward came to be seen as a reluctant hero, a man who faced his past mistakes and fought not only for his family, but for justice for many. Weeks later, with Elizabeth finally home recovering, the family gathered in the small living room of their modest house. Edward, looking at Elizabeth and Sophia, felt a wave of love and gratitude he had never experienced before. "I thought I was fighting to correct my mistakes," he said softly. "But in truth, you saved me. You gave me a purpose, a reason to be better." Elizabeth smiled, still pale but with eyes shining with love. "We saved each other, Edward. That's what families do." Sophia, nestled between the two, asked innocently, "And now, what are we going to do?" Edward exchanged a glance with Elizabeth before answering, "Now, my love, we're going to live. We'll build our life together one day at a time." As the sun set over New York, casting a golden glow through the window of the small shack, Edward, Elizabeth, and Sophia remained embraced. They had faced the past, fought against powerful forces, and emerged victorious. But their greatest adventure was just beginning, the journey of being a family. Outside, the city continued its frantic pace, but there, in that small space that was now truly a home, there was peace. A peace earned with courage, forgiveness, and above all, love.